Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today is spoiler season Day 3 for Burrow. We have a ton of new cards to go over, so we are going to jump right into it. Before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. It's you guys that are liking the video every time that has helped this channel to grow so quickly, and I honestly appreciate the hell out of all of you guys that have been helping me. We just hit 10k subscribers, and that's just insane to me, so thank you guys so much. Please hit that like button. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy spoiler content on the way. Tons of crazy deck ideas coming for Burrow Early Access, which we will be a part of, so look forward to that. More information on that soon, but let's just jump right into the cards here. First up, we've got Splash Lasher. 1 blue and 3 for a 3/3 frog wizard with Offspring 1 blue and 1, which means as you play this card, you can pay an extra 2 mana. And if you do, when it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 token copy that is a copy of this card except for the fact that it's a 1/1. It even gets the casting cost, which is kind of interesting, and it has all of the abilities. So the second ability here will be on that copy if you pay the Offspring cost. When this creature enters the battlefield, you tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. So nice little bit of limited removal, temporary removal value, if you will, for frogs, for the frog tribal archetype in limited, because you get it early, you play it on turn 4, you lock down a creature, which is nice, but if you draw into this a little bit later in the game, you can dump 6 mana into it, get 2 bodies, lock down 2 different creatures, and each of them get a stun counter. Or if you want to get really clever with it and you have a very problematic bomb on the board, you could actually have the copy target the same thing as the initial one, and even though tapping it down twice isn't going to do anything, each one will put a stun counter on it, so it'll get 2 stun counters, and that will actually matter. So some really interesting limited tech here. I really like the direction they're going with frogs. But next up we have Emberheart Challenger, our first rare of the day. This is a 2/2 mouse warrior with haste and prowess for 1 red and 1. That's already kind of insane, but on top of that it has Valiant, so whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability that you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library, and until end of turn you may play that card. So having a card that's as good as any other 2-drop in the, fast mono red prowess style decks is kind of nuts, but having that card give you card advantage as well, if you have some extra mana to sink into targeting it with spells and, have mana left over to actually play the thing that you exile. The one thing that is worth noting is the Valiant ability only exiles the card until end of turn. You have to play it that turn. So you do have to be very careful to play like your cheapest spell targeting this first, see what you exile, and then plan the rest of your turn around that. But just seems really powerful. Honestly, I would consider putting this in the new, mono red or is it style aggro decks that have been in standard lately just for the 2/2 haste prowess for 2. So the fact that it has that Valiant trigger just makes this a surefire slam dunk in those decks, I think. Such a good card. Next up we have Peerless Recycling, 1 green and 1 for an instant, and as you play it you may gift a card. What this means is that you promise the gift to an opponent, and if you do, you get to they get to draw a card before the rest of the card's abilities resolve. So they get the card first, but you don't have to gift a card. You don't have to choose to do that. The other ability of the card, the actual meat and potatoes of the card, is you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, and if the gift was promised, instead return 2 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. So nice little bit of value here. The fact that it's instant speed means you can hold things up on your opponent's turn, like instant speed removal or counter spells, and then if you don't need to, use those cards, you can just play this. But I like that you have, sort of the versatility of getting to just bring back your best thing, or if, a second thing you would bring back ends up getting you way more value than a random card that they are drawing, you have the opportunity to get 2 things back by gifting them something. And sometimes later in the game when you have a really crazy bomb or some kind of value engine that's going to get you multiple cards worth of value, it's going to be very, very worth it to just let them draw just 1 card to get that back in addition to the other thing that you want to get back. So pretty cool little card here. I like it. Next up we have Feather of Flight, 1 white and 1 for an enchantment aura with flash. It enchants a creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card, and then the enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and flying. Now, we've seen a lot of abilities for auras where when the creature dies, you get to draw a card to sort of make up for that card disadvantage for if, you know, you enchant one of your dudes and then they get rid of it with creature removal. They're getting rid of the creature and the aura by just spending one card, and that's huge card advantage for them. So auras tend to have ways, at least lately over the last few years, of giving you a little bit of extra advantage or replacing themselves when they're gone. But what makes this one way more interesting is it doesn't wait until the creature dies to let you draw a card, right? It draws you a card as soon as it enters. So it's just, you get that value immediately, which seems crazy to me. Giving your guy evasion in limited as well is going to be really, really good. And the flash part of it is interesting. I don't know if that will come up very often, but being able to give yourself a flying blocker at instant speed when your opponent doesn't see it coming should be pretty good. And even if that card needs to die in combat, blocking whatever they're swinging with, the fact that you draw a card to replace this immediately kind of makes it great no matter what. So nice, cool little combat trick for sure in limited. Next up, we have Mist Breath Elder, and this card is way better than just being confined to limited. This is a 2/2 Frog Warrior for just 1 green mana, so it's already just better than Savannah Lions. It's not even legendary. How far we've come, right? Power creep. At the beginning of your upkeep, you return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Mist Breath Elder. Otherwise, you may return Mist Breath Elder to its owner's hand. So, couple things I want to note here. If you have a creature on the battlefield, you do have to return it if it's another creature that isn't the Elder. You don't have a choice. You can't just have this and one really balmy creature that you want to be swinging with, and those are your only creatures, and you can choose to return the Elder instead, or you can choose to not return the other guy. If you have this and you have another creature, you have to return that other creature, which can be detrimental for board states sometimes, but I don't think you're playing this guy in a deck where you want to keep big beaters like that on the battlefield. You're clearly building around this guy in a deck where you want to keep returning your creatures to your hand. So I don't really think that will matter too much. The other thing that I want to point out is if you can't return another creature, if this is the only creature out, you may return the Elder to its owner's hand, so you don't have to. This can stay on the battlefield. If this has been on the battlefield for like 7 turns and has 7 counters on it and is a 9/9, and now it's the only thing on the battlefield, you don't have to return it, right? You can keep it on the battlefield and keep it as a 9/9, and that is really nice, and I think it's really easily overlooked as well. That being said, even if you don't have something to bounce to your hand, like being able to return this to your hand to replay it so that every turn you have a 1-drop creature to replay, I think is gonna matter, because this set, especially with Frog Tribal, seems to really care about, you know, bouncing creatures back to your hand and replaying them. There seems to be a lot of ways getting value, like if you played a creature this turn, trigger this thing, stuff like that. So even if you're just returning the Elder to your hand every turn and replaying it and getting all of those different synergies, I think those types of synergies are going to be deep enough in this set for even that to be kind of good, and I think that will also be a part of this card that's overlooked. But obviously the best part about this card is just you return something to your hand every turn that you want to recast, a creature that has a really good enters the battlefield ability, or maybe you know, some other kind of value you can get from recasting your creatures, and you absolutely just build your deck around that. And in that way, this is almost like a Nurturing Pixie, except every turn. Now, unlike Nurturing Pixie, it can only target creatures, whereas the Pixie can pick up like artifacts or enchantments or whatever. But what's really cool to note is the fact that you could run this with the Pixie, bounce the Pixie back to your hand every turn, replay it to bounce like an enchantment like Hopeless Nightmare or something like that back to your hand to replay that every turn. So in a way, you could replay your Pixie every turn with the Elder and replay whatever permanent you want every turn with the Pixie and get some crazy value. I don't know if it's worth jumping through that hoop, but it's definitely worth exploring, I think. At the very least, I think the Pixie might want to go into whatever deck the Elder wants to be in and have these 8 cards that can pick stuff up so that you can recast them, as long as it's actually creatures. So a lot of different stuff you can do with this. I could kind of go on and on and on about this card because I think it's going to be one of the sleeper hits of the set. But it's just cool. And Frog Tribal in general, the direction that it's going, wanting you to constantly bounce your stuff back to your hand, is not only really interesting mechanically, but also a huge flavor win for frogs, so I'm really excited about it. But next up, we've got Bark Form Harvester. 3 mana for a 2/3 artifact creature shapeshifter. It has Changeling, so it counts as every creature type. And in a set that cares about creature types as much as this one, that is huge. Not to mention, just in Standard, there are other creature types that aren't really explored in Bloomburrow that this is going to count as and might be really good in, that might get overlooked when this set first comes out. And that will be really interesting as well. But it also has Reach, which is a nice little bit of upside, and then for 2 mana, you can put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. So this is that one card in the set we seem to get every set that lets you somehow save yourself from being milled out if you're up against a mill deck. So pretty cool little card. Definitely the fact that it's Changeling is the most interesting part of it, and it pretty much goes into almost every limited deck. I would not be surprised if this is a high pick in limited, just because there are like, what, 10 different tribal themes that are super deep and compelling and have tons of payoffs, and this can just slot into all of them. So I would pay attention to this card for sure for limited. Next up, we have HIV Spine Wolverine, a 5/4 elemental Wolverine for 2 green and 3. And when it enters, you get to choose one. You either put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, or it fights another creature token, or you destroy an artifact or enchantment. I actually like this guy a fair bit. A 5 mana 5/4 isn't super good, but I think the versatility of the ETB is going to be very, very overlooked. At its core, you've got a 5/4 for 5 that's getting you card advantage when you play it. You're either killing a creature token, which there's going to be a lot more of in this set than normal, so the fact that this can only kill a token, I think people are going to think that's way worse than it actually is, because in limited in this set, that's actually going to be super relevant. There's going to be a ton of tokens popping around, Offspring and all that, so fighting a token and killing a token is a huge bit of upside, or also being able to destroy an artifact or enchantment. So even though any one of those things isn't necessarily, doesn't necessarily have a high chance of happening, the fact that it can do any one of those 3 things, I think most of the time you're going to be able to destroy something when you play this. They'll have a token creature or an artifact or an enchantment. They've got to have like one of the 3. Maybe not, super consistently, but definitely consistently enough that I think most times that you play this, you're going to be destroying something, which is really nice. But the fact that you have this extra ability where even if you don't have something to destroy or fight or whatever, you can at least put a +1/+1 counter on something, and that could be on itself, making it, a 6/5 for 5, which isn't that bad. Or you could just put it on another creature that has a more relevant ability, like Double Strike or First Strike, or maybe it's, a flyer. So I think the versatility of this card makes it a lot better than it looks on the surface. It looks like it's just a 5/4 dumb guy with, a negligible ability that won't matter that often. But in reality, I think this guy is going to be a lot better than he looks. Next up, we've got Hired Claw, another rare. This is 1 red mana for a 1/2 lizard mercenary. Whenever you attack with 1 or more lizards, he deals 1 damage to target opponent. You can also pay 1 red and 1 to put a +1/+1 counter on him, but only activate that if an opponent lost life this turn. So nice little 1-drop for Lizard Tribal. The fact that you ping every turn, like if you play this guy on 1, every combat step you're going to be pinging, right? And you don't even need to attack with the Hired Claw. I think that's what makes it cool. You get in for a little bit of damage turn, 2, maybe even turn 3, and then if they have a creature down that's big enough that they could block, you just don't attack with this guy. He just hangs back, and your bigger lizards that can get through safely are swinging and still triggering him and still doing 1 damage to the opponent. And I think that's another part of this card that's kind of overlooked, and I think that's why this is a rare. I think it's very easy to just kind of like snowball into being able to attack with something that's a lizard each turn. It doesn't necessarily have to be the claw, always getting your trigger, and in that way, just having a much shorter clock on your opponent than you otherwise might. And then the fact that this can also just start to beef up when you run out of gas. Even if you're not attacking with the claw, you're swinging with your other bigger lizards, doing that 1 ping of damage, and then getting to just dump your extra mana. into the claw to buff it up because you're out of gas and don't have spells to play. So nice little mana sink late in the game that's really easy to trigger with your other lizards. I think the package as a whole is a lot better than it might seem on the surface, but I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. Really cool card though. Next up we have Burrow Guard Mentor. This is a rabbit soldier with trample for 2 mana in the colors of Selesnya, and it has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. So when you play this, if it's the only creature you have, it's just a 1/1 trample for 2, which is kinda bad, but it's a 1/1 trample for 2 that's going to scale with every creature that you play. And when you take that into account, it actually seems a little bit better even if it just comes down as a 1/1 initially, and the fact that it counts as a rabbit and a soldier is going to matter for a lot of different tribal payoffs, which is really nice. But I think most of the time you're playing a 1-drop on 1, you're playing this as a 2/2 trampler on 2, which is on rate, and then it's just getting bigger as the game goes on. So I think this is going to be a key part in Rabbit Tribal in Limited for sure, and it might even be good enough to see play in Constructed because it could get really big really quick. If rabbits go as deep into token creatures as I think they are, and the token creatures are as efficient as it seems like they're going to be, this could blow up into a huge creature very quickly, and the trample is super relevant. So very cool little card here. I like it a lot. Next up we have Downwind Ambusher. This is 1 black and 3 for a 4/2 skunk assassin with flash, and when it enters the battlefield you get to choose one. You either destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn, or target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This card is another one that's way better than it looks. I'm used to getting these sort of abilities that give you a very fragile body that destroys a creature on ETB if that creature was already dealt damage. Like, we've seen a lot of cards that do that. We've even seen some that have flash, like this one. But having the ability to also give something -1/-1 until end of turn instead is huge, because on those turns where you don't have something to destroy with this that already took damage, you still have something you can do, right? You can still slam this in the middle of combat and kill a 1/1 token, kill something that's Offspring, right? I think the fact that every Offspring card makes a copy that is a 1/1 no matter what, makes something like -1/-1 until end of turn way more powerful in a format where that ability is going to be very prevalent. So that -1/-1 matters a huge amount. So having that as an extra ability on a thing that can kill any creature that was damaged, and be a combat trick because of flash, and trade up because of the 4 power, like, this guy just seems really good. I think if any one of the pieces of that were missing, he would just kind of be okay, but when you take the entire card into account, I think he's actually really good. I think he's going to be a high pick in Limited. That -1/-1 ability, just being able to kill any Offspring token, is really good. And probably will be really underrated until people realize just how good it is. Next up we have the infamous Cruel Claw, a 3/3 legendary weasel mercenary for 3 mana in the colors of Rakdos. It has Menace, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. I don't know if you guys realize how good that is. When I first read this card, I thought you exiled cards from the top of your opponent's library, which is still really good, but not as good, because obviously your deck's going to be built around trying to take advantage of the Cruel Claw as much as you can. Being able to just swing in with Menace, have a better chance of dealing combat damage because of that Menace, and just, you play something for free. It's almost like half of an Atali every turn, or half of a Breach the Multiverse every turn, right? You don't hit something of your opponent's, but you hit something of yours. Now granted, you have to exile a card. That just means you're not getting sheer card advantage. It would be way too good if you were, right? But a way to think about this is it just turns one of the cards in your hand, your worst card in your hand, just turns into a 0 cost copy of, you know, one of the cards in your deck. And when you think about it like that, that's kind of crazy. You just get to, you know, discard a card, I guess, to play the thing for free. So it's basically the same as if the card in your hand that you would discard is just a free copy of the thing that you're casting. It's the same thing, right? Either way, you'd be using up a card in your hand. So getting to discard a card to play the thing for free is actually a little bit better because you can trigger things that care about discarding, like Hostile Investigator, or is it Negotiator? Hostile Negotiator? I think it's, yeah, it's Hostile Negotiator, I believe. That guy can give you a clue token because you discarded, right? You have other things you can trigger with the discard, like the Raven Man, stuff like that. So you get even more value off of it being, you know, this discard thing. That makes it even a little bit better. So I don't know. I just think this card is insane. As long as you can get through for it, getting a free spell every turn just seems nuts to me. And the cost is way better than it might seem. So I like it a lot. We're gonna brew around this for sure. But next up we have Star Charter. This is 1 white and 3 for a 3/1 flying bat cleric. And at the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with power 3 or less from among them. Put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This guy is so good in Limited. It's very easy to overlook when you look at the stat line and the cost. It seems kind of meh. But having a 3 power flyer that can contribute to your win condition, right, be able to swing in evasively, is not bad. It's not good enough for a 4-drop for sure, but this ability is just insane card advantage in Limited. Now, way too expensive for Constructed, for sure. But in Limited, being able to trigger this, you know, potentially every single time you gain life or lose life, seems nuts. It's not once per turn, right? Oh, it is once per turn. It's at the beginning of your end step, right? Yeah, and it only triggers once regardless of if you both gained and lost life. So maybe it's not as good as I thought, but still, getting a free creature at the end of your turn, every turn, if you're consistently gaining or losing life, still seems really good to me. It is a little bit expensive, and its body is pretty fragile, and you do have to jump through some hoops to try and snatch a creature off the top, but you also get to look at the top 4 when you do it. So I keep going back and forth with this card. You know what? I think this card is good enough. Getting card selection, getting to look at the top 4, ensures that you almost definitely always hit something in Limited. And because you have 2 different ways to trigger this, either gaining life or losing life, you have twice as many potential ways to actually get this ability to trigger. If it was just when you gain life or just when you lose life, it would be significantly less powerful, and I'd be a little bit more wary of the card. But the fact that it could trigger on either of these, I'm just hoping there's a decent amount of ways to actually pay life for things in one of the archetypes in this set. If there is, I'm not sure. If you've seen anything like that, let me know in the comments. Because there's definitely going to be a lot of life gain, and that is going to be a very good, consistent way to trigger this, and this wants to be in that deck for sure. But it'll be really interesting if there's a whole deck archetype we can build around paying life for things that this can also slot into, and that's a whole different deck than the life gain deck would be. So, I don't know, pretty card. Very back and forth on if it's good enough, but I think the sheer card advantage it can provide, I think it's definitely worth exploring. I'm leaning towards it is. Next up we have Stargaze, 2 black and X for a sorcery. Look at twice X cards from the top of your library, and then put X cards from among them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. You lose X life. So it's basically 2 mana X, draw X cards. But it's a little bit better than that because you get to draw X cards from double the amount of X. You get to look at them and get card selection, and the rest go into your graveyard, which matters because there are a lot of things that can pull stuff out of your graveyard or that can make the graveyard matter. Stuff like Threshold and Forage in this set are going to care about your graveyard. So even just putting half of the cards in the graveyard is a really important part of the card that shouldn't be overlooked. That's going to be really valuable in certain Limited decks. But even just drawing X in Limited, this feels really good. Now, granted, you lose a lot of life, but if we combine this with that last card we looked at, losing the life will trigger the Star Charter as well. And if we're playing it in a deck where it's a life gain deck where you have a lot of ways to gain life, we can maybe make up for that loss of life by drawing into a bunch of cards that are just going to gain the life back. So a lot of really cool potential implications for this card that are worth exploring. It's hard to say if it's going to work out in the end until we try it, but it's possible this ends up being a really crazy uncommon that is very sought after, because in the mid to late game it could just gas you up, and that card selection and just filling up your graveyard with stuff you need in there could make all the difference in the world. So just a really cool card. I like it. I feel like I say that about a lot of cards, but this is Dawn's Truce. 1 white and 1 for an instant. As you play it, you can gift a card, which means you'll let your opponent draw a card before the rest of the card resolves. And then what does it do? You and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. If the gift was promised, permanents you control also gain indestructible until end of turn. This is really good, because what you can do is, if they're trying to use targeted removal, you just play this without gifting anything, right? And you basically counter that removal, which is really nice protection. But having a card that's instant speed protection like that also double as like sweeper protection, where if they're gonna wipe your whole board with some kind of sweeper, you can then let them draw a card in order to keep your whole board by giving your whole board indestructible. So I really like the gift a card here. I like that you're only going to use it when it gets you card advantage. They might be drawing a card, but you're saving multiple creatures from dying, so you're still getting card advantage at the end of the day and making them waste their sweeper, and now it's out of their hand, and unless they're lucky and they have a second sweeper to play, which most of the times isn't going to be the case, you now have free reign to play your stuff out. You still have your board, you're swinging in. I like the versatility of this card. I like that it can go either way. I see why it's a rare, even though on the surface it might look like it's not quite good enough to be a rare. This card, I think, is going to be really good. I like this. I like this. We're gonna use this. But next up, we've got Life Creed Duo. This is 1 white and 1 for a 1/2 bat bird with flying, and whenever another creature you control enters, you gain a life. I like this. Now, I feel like I've said that about most of the cards, but I do. Especially as a common, you know? We're used to getting 1-drops with this ability where you gain a life whenever a creature you control enters. So when you compare it to stuff like that, it looks kind of meh. But when you take into account the fact that it has flying, it has an extra point of toughness, it's only common, so it's really easy to pick up multiple copies of this in limited, which is really going to matter. And then the most overlooked part of this card is the fact that it is both a bat and a bird. And any creature in this set that has 2 tribes that are, you know, both one of the 10 important tribes that are getting a focus, that are getting a lot of synergy, is going to matter. And this does have that. It has the black-white tribe being bats, and the white, I believe it's white-blue is birds, right? It has both of those creature types, which means you can cross-pollinate your bat and bird synergies in the same deck. And this guy's going to get all of the payoffs of all of them, while also giving you life triggers every time you play a creature, while also being a mobile platform to just put auras or equipments or +1/+1 counters or whatever on, because you got that flying, and maybe you can swing in and just win the game with it. So there's a lot that this can do at the common slot, and I think it's great. I kind of love this card. I think it's going to be crucial. You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is going to be a very high pick, because the decks that want to play life gain and get all of the life gain triggers they can for different synergies that trigger off that life gain, they're going to want as many of this card as possible. This is going to be such a backbone card for that deck, but it's also just good in any bat or bird deck. So I think this is going to be a very high pick. You're going to want to grab as many of these as possible when you're in that archetype, and definitely on launch day, I'm going to try and dig into this as deep as I can, because I think once people start to realize that, it's going to be really hard to get multiple copies of this in the same deck in limited. But, you know, day 1, day 2, gloves are off, man. Being able to stack like 3 copies of this guy in the same deck seems like it's going to be super fun. Let's do it. Next up, we've got Finch Formation. This is a 2/2 bird scout for 1 blue and 2. It has flying. When it enters, target creature you control gains flying until end of turn, and it also has Offspring 3. Now, what I like about this card is it's basically a 6 mana win condition, right? For 6 mana, you draw this later in the game. You slam it down. You give your 2 biggest guys flying until end of turn because you have that offspring ability, right? And you just swing in for the win. That's like primarily what you should think of this card as being. But what makes this way better than other cards that have been like that in the past is the fact that if you have it early, it's not useless. It's not this 6 mana thing that's just sitting in your hand waiting for you to be in a situation where you can use it as a win condition, right? You can actually play it out if you don't have any better plays on turn 3 or even subsequent turns after that. You can just play it out as a 2/2 flyer for 3, which is kind of fine and gives you a little bit of upside in the meantime, giving something flying until end of turn. And that's okay. The fact that your big win con can also double as something you can play on curve if you're desperate is super, super important to note. And it counts as a bird, so it's going to get any of your bird, tribal payoffs as well. So even though it's just a 2/2 flyer, I think a lot of times this might come down in the bird deck and get some buffs from other things and be better than just a 2/2 flyer. But I like all of that at common, right? I mean, it's not a crazy card. It's not going to set the world on fire. You're not going to first pick this or anything. It's probably your 22nd, 23rd card in your limited deck. But for, jamming a common as a win condition as your 22nd or 23rd, card slot, you could do a lot worse than something like this. So I like it. Next up, we've got Longstalk Brawl. 1 green for a sorcery. You may gift a tapped fish to an opponent as you play it. You choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. Put a +1/+1 counter on the creature you control if the gift was promised. And then those creatures fight each other. I kind of love this. Just getting a 1 mana fight spell is good enough on its own. But having that versatility of, I got a 4/4, but you have a 4/4 and I don't want to trade my creature. You just give them a 1/1 and then get a counter and make sure that you kill their guy and keep yours. And that alone's pretty good, but then the fact that the counter sticks around forever gives you even more upside off of having to gift that tapped fish. So I like the versatility there. You're going to be trying to just use this as removal, but you have the option of giving your opponent a little dude if the situation's right for it, where you can actually take advantage of the counter in a significant way. So really cool. I love it, especially as a common, just 1 mana removal. This is going to see a lot of play. Next up, we have Byway Barter. This is another rare. It's a 3/3 Raccoon Rogue with Menace for 1 red and 2. We have seen a lot of 3/3 Menace for 3 in this set already. Menace Tribal. I think everybody is going to be focused on certain creature tribal decks. I think we need to build Menace Tribal. I think we just need to build a Menace deck after this set comes out. I'm seeing a lot of Menace. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. When you expend 4, you may discard your hand, and if you do, draw 2 cards. This is kind of awesome, because it's a May, you don't have to do it, and it triggers without having to spend any mana whatsoever. You just play 4 mana worth of spells from your hand, and if you do, you get to discard your hand and draw 2 cards, and you don't have to. So if you have more than 2 cards in your hand, just keep your hand, but if you're down to like 1 card or 0 cards, you just get to discard whatever, discard the 1 or the nothing, and then draw 2 cards just for playing the things you'd be playing anyway. You don't have to spend any extra mana, you don't have to do anything differently than you would do on your turn. So the fact that you get all of that for free, tacked onto a body that's already fine for 3 mana, 3/3 Menace for 3, seems pretty good. But it's a rogue, so it counts as an outlaw for outlaw tribal. It's a raccoon, so you can go wide for raccoon tribal. When you start to get some of those synergies and those payoffs in those decks on top of everything this card is just doing in a vacuum, I think that's where this card really shines. And I would not be surprised to see this in a raccoon deck or an outlaw deck after this set launches, even in constructed. It's just free value. It's just crazy free value later in the game, and I kind of love it. Next up, we've got DDrop Cure. This is 1 white and 2 for a sorcery. As you play it, you may gift a card, and you return up to 2 target creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the gift was promised, instead return up to 3 target creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Good God. 3 mana for 3 2-drops. This is like Collected Company on crack. Granted, you need to have the stuff in your graveyard already. You know, you're not, sifting through the top of your deck to find them. But that's just an insane amount of value. And you don't even have to return the third thing, right? If you only have 2, then you don't have to gift a card. If you have 3, but the third one is super meh and not worth giving them, a whole card, drawing a whole card, just don't do it. But if the 3 creatures you're going to get back are all significant and it's worth letting them draw 1 card so that you have this crazy insta board, then you absolutely do it. And having that versatility to choose is, again, something that's going to make this card kind of be that much better than it otherwise would be. And I don't know, I love this. There's got to be some kind of crazy aggro deck where we just curve out with an insane board, our opponent uses up all their removal to get rid of it, and then we just bring all of our crazy 2-drops, our rare, ridiculously overstated 2-drops, just back from the graveyard, right? That's got to be a thing. We're going to build something like that. We've got to. Does this just go into Boros Convoke? I don't know, maybe. But next up, we've got Thought Shucker. Thought Shucker. Is he trying to eat a clam? I think he's... I guess that makes sense. This is a 1/3 rat rogue for 1 blue and 1. Again, loving that we're seeing mono blue rats here. It has Threshold, so if you have at least 7 cards in your graveyard, you may pay 1 blue and 1 to put a +1/+1 counter on Thought Shucker and draw a card. And Threshold being you can only activate that if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. This is kind of great for a common, honestly. This is one of the better commons we've seen. The body isn't awful, right? It stops 2-power creatures early, stops a little bit of aggression, counts as a rat and a rogue for outlaw synergies, for rat synergies, all that stuff. But if you're in a deck that can get Threshold pretty quick, that's a really good mana sink. That's a mana sink I would not expect to see on a common. Just pay 2 mana, draw a card, put a counter on it. Pay 2 mana, draw a card, put a counter on it, right? Okay, you can only activate it. The wording, you can only activate it once a game, I'm pretty sure. It doesn't say until end of turn, it says only once. So I guess you can only activate it once. I guess yeah, now that I think about it, it would be way too good, even as an uncommon, if you could just use it as many times as you wanted, or use it even once a turn. It would be pretty insane. So that makes sense, and that makes sense that it's a common now. But still, I mean, even if you're doing it just once in a game, getting to turn your 2-drop into a 2/4 and drawing a card to replace it for just 2 mana still seems pretty good. I think this is going to be a very popular common in Limited for people that are going into rats. I think this will be used a lot to fill out a deck, when you're coming up a few cards short. So, really cool common. I like it. I know I say that about every card. I feel like a broken record, but I like these cards. I don't know what to tell you. Coruscation Mage. This is a 2/2 otter wizard for 1 red and 1. It has Offspring 2. So if you spend a total of 4 mana, you get a 1/1 copy of this guy. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. This gets kind of gross. Because you slam this on 2, and then all of your non-creature spells in your Spellslinger deck are just dealing an extra damage to the opponent regardless of whatever the spell does. But what's really cool is the thing you want to play on 2 to get all of these triggers also has extra value if you top deck it later. So normally the problem with a card like this is when you're out of gas a little bit later in the game and then you top deck one, well, now it's just a crappy creature that you don't have any spells left to trigger it with, right? But by having the Offspring 2 ability, you top deck this later on when you're out of gas, you have plenty of mana to just make the extra copy, and now, even if you just have 1 spell, right, it's going to be way more significant and do more. That 1 spell is going to shock the opponent instead of just pinging them. So that makes this way better later in the game than cards like this usually are. Usually it's a super bummer to, top deck one of these, but, this makes it super relevant. It means everything you draw now is going to be at least a shock. And you have 2 bodies, which means you could potentially, chump block something to stay alive an extra turn so that you can draw into a spell. And even if you lose 1, you still get to keep 1, so you still get to ping for 1 when you play a spell. A lot of little silver lining upside on this guy. I think he's going to be really cool. I am excited to see if there's some kind of a spell slinger deck in Standard that actually uses this guy, because I think the potential is certainly there. Next up we have Inkeeper Talent. This is another rare, and it's a class. We're seeing the return of enchantment classes in this set. This is 1 green and 1, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So it's basically a Luminarch Aspirant without a body. It literally comes down on 2 like Luminarch Aspirant. The downside being you don't have a 2/2 creature attached to it. You know, it can't buff itself up. But the upside being they can't remove it with creature removal, which is significant. And you have 2 other abilities you can level up into here. For just 1 green mana, it goes to level 2 and makes it so that permanents you control with counters on them have Ward 1. It's not even just creatures, it's just permanents. Your battles, your planeswalkers, anything with counters on them now have Ward 1. That seems pretty good for just 1 extra mana. And then for 1 green and 3, you can level it up to level 3, and if you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, you put twice that many on it instead. So it's kind of like a mini Vorinclex ability, on top of a free Luminarch Aspirant every turn, on top of protection, giving all of your things with counters Ward 1. This card seems really good. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this card is really good. There are going to be decks absolutely in Constructed that use this card. I don't know what yet. Does it go into Super Friends? Super Friends that focus on planeswalkers that spit out creature tokens so that you can put +1/+1 counters on them with the first ability. And that's something to keep in mind too. As you level this up, it keeps all of the other abilities it already had. So it just becomes this crazy permanent that gives you so much value eventually. But I don't know. I think if we're in a deck that's going wide with creatures, that first ability to put counters on things is going to be really relevant. It turns on any, you know, modified bonuses that something might get for being modified. Does it go in +1/+1 counter? Tribal? Probably. Like, I could just see so many different places this can slot in. Is it actually going to be good enough at the end of the day? It's going to really depend on how those decks curve out and where this fits in, because you got to remember, if you're playing this on 2, you're not playing a creature on 2, it's taking up your creature drop, which means if you're playing it in a creature deck, you're kind of losing tempo as far as playing out your creatures to be aggressive with to play this instead. So that makes it a little bit harder to justify, but maybe it doesn't go there. Maybe it goes in Super Friends, or maybe it goes in the creature deck but doesn't come down on 2. Or maybe it does come down on 2, but you're playing a lot of 1-drops, so you're always consistently playing a 1-drop creature and then playing this on 2. I'm not sure. But I do know the power level is definitely there, it's worth exploring with, and I would be very surprised if there wasn't some kind of standard deck that used this. Next up we have Thistledown Players. 1 white and 2 for a 3/3 Mouse Bard, and when it attacks you untap target non-land permanent. Not bad for a common. Again, I think what's going to make this a little bit better than it looks like is just the fact that it's a mouse. It's going to get all of your mouse synergies. But other than that, it's just a 3/3 with basically Super Menace. Or not Super Menace, Super Vigilance, right? It can untap itself, or it can untap something else if you need to. But you have to attack in order to do it. Not great. This is probably the first card I've seen today that I'm just kind of on. That being said, it's not unplayable. You know, if you're in Mouse Tribal and you need to fill out your curve, you could do a lot worse, so it's fine. Next up we have Bone Cache Overseer. This is 1 black mana for a 1/1 Squirrel Warlock. Never thought I'd ever say that line. You can tap it, pay 1 life to draw a card, but activate only if 3 or more cards left your graveyard this turn, or if you sacrificed a food this turn. So clearly this guy wants to be paired up with Forage, or Squirrel Tribal, or both, right? Because the Forage ability lets you activate certain abilities by foraging, which means you either exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. So since this guy triggers off every time, you know, you're exiling cards from your graveyard or sacrificing foods, it's going to trigger every time you forage, regardless of, you know, which cost you use to pay for the forage. And that's nice. But I also wonder if this guy might be usable in something like an Insidious Roots deck, because as you're exiling your creatures, it's really easy to just tap this guy and draw an extra card pretty much every turn, right? And that seems kind of cool to me. So maybe in a deck like that as well, some kind of self-mill deck in Standard, I could see this being a world, there being a world where this is played in Constructed, and it's just drawing you a card every turn, unless the opponent deals with it. But if they do, they wasted their removal on your 1-drop instead of your better creatures in the deck, so maybe it's worth it. Especially if there is a Squirrel deck that, you know, digs into these synergies, and it seems like that's going to be the case, that's viable in Constructed, in Standard. I'd be very surprised if there isn't. If Bloom Burrow comes out and Squirrels aren't relevant in Standard, then Wizards, you're doing it wrong, right? So it'll be interesting to see if this card can make the cut. But next up we have Treet Top Sentries. This is 1 green and 3 for a 2/4 Squirrel Archer with reach, and when it enters you may forage if you do draw a card. Nice little common here. It's gonna, you know, fill out your curve if you're missing 4-drops, but it's nothing crazy, right? When it enters, you have to forage to draw a card, and that's fine. So if you're making, you know, food tokens earlier in the game or filling up your graveyard, you just have the opportunity to get a 2/4 reach that draws a card. 4 mana is a lot, but drawing a card is nice, so I think if you're in a deck where you're able to create a bunch of food tokens so that foraging is very inconsequential, there's really no downside to do it. You have plenty of foods, right? You don't have to worry about saving them for better forage abilities, stuff like that. I think in that deck, this gets a little bit more valuable, and I could see it justified being, you know, playing it a little bit more. But, you know, if you don't have a lot of enabling for forage and your 1 food you have to waste on this instead of like a better forage payoff, it's going to feel kind of bad. So it's going to be really tricky to see just what deck this guy's going to slot into best. That being said, it's just a common, right? So it's meant to fill out your curve if you're coming up short. Next up we have Vren the Relentless, one of my favorite cards of the day. This is a 3/4 legendary rat rogue for 1 black, 1 blue, and 2, so in the colors of Dimir. It has Ward 2. If a creature an opponent controls would die, you exile it instead. That's already decent, right? They don't get any graveyard shenanigans. They're always gone when this thing's on the battlefield, and it protects itself decently well with the Ward 2, and it counts as a rat, and it counts as an outlaw. All of that is relevant. But the part about this card that makes it absolutely insane, at the beginning of each end step, create X 1/1 black rat creature tokens that have the ability, this creature gets +1/+1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponents controlled that were exiled this turn. Good God. Every time you kill a creature, not only is it exiled, but you get a 1/1. Every single time you kill a creature, you get a 1/1. And all of those 1/1s not only get bigger from each other, but get bigger from Vren, and get bigger from every other rat you're playing. This is just the most no-brainer inclusion in Rat Tribal. It's definitely the most no-brainer card we've seen yet. Like, this just slam dunk automatically goes in every rat deck as a 4-of. It's insane. It basically gives you a Relentless Rat token every time you kill something. Every single time you kill something. And those things that are dying are getting exiled, so they can't do graveyard shenanigans. This is broken. This is so good. Granted, it's a 4-drop, but I mean, Sheoldred is a 4-drop. Is this as good as Sheoldred? I don't know. Probably not, but it's close. It's really good. It's going to give you an insta board without even needing any other creatures, right? You could just run this in a control deck where you're just removing everything and just generating an insane board by doing so. And then even if they do kill Vren later on, like, you still have all of your rats, and they're still buffed up by all of your other rats. It's a nightmare. I love this card. Let's do it. We're doing it. Let's do it. Next up, we've got Conduct Electricity. 1 red and 4 for an instant. And this is a card I don't love. It deals 6 damage to target creature, and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature token. That being said, it's not useless. It's not as bad as it looks. I still don't like it. I still think it's kind of bad, but it's not as bad as it looks, because it's instant speed, and you're almost always going to have a token to hit, especially like I mentioned earlier in this video because of Offspring. Being able to kill a super relevant Offspring token and a huge 6 toughness threat with 1 card at instant speed is actually relevant. That's actually good. 5 mana is a lot, but you know what? The more I think about this, it's never going to see play in Constructed, but in Limited, I actually think this will get picked fairly often. 5 mana, we've seen a lot worse for removal. The fact that it's instant speed, and it's almost always going to kill 2 things, and one of those things is going to be a really big nasty bomb probably. I like this a lot. I wouldn't like it as much if Offspring didn't exist in this set, but because of Offspring and Rabbit Tribal using tokens and all these other tokens, you're almost always going to be able to kill something. And normally, if it was a different set, those tokens are going to be way less relevant. Almost all tokens in other sets are super irrelevant little 1/1s or whatever, right? But because this set is so deep into Offspring, there's a good chance that when you kill the token with this, it's going to be a very relevant token. And even if it isn't, the consistency of them at least having a token to hit with this is going to be very high. So you're almost always killing some kind of token creature with this and getting a 2-for-1. And a lot of times you're probably killing a very relevant token that's an Offspring token. So those 2 things taken into account, this card's way better than it looks. It's almost always a 2-for-1. It's almost always killing a bomb and something else. And it's doing it at instant speed. Yeah, the more I think about this card, the more I like it. I still don't think it's a very high pick, but it's absolutely gonna see play. Absolutely. Next up, we have Dire Sight. 1 black and 2 for a sorcery. You surveil 2, then draw 2, then lose 2 life. Nice little bit of card advantage here. I like the surveil in this set because you're setting yourself up for things like Forage and Threshold. You're putting stuff in your graveyard that you want in your graveyard, and that's going to matter. That makes this card a little bit better than it would be. And you also get to lose 2 life, and there are definitely cards in this set that depend on you losing life on your turn in order to trigger. We saw one of them earlier in this video, but there's a bunch of them, it seems. So that actually matters way more than it looks. It just seems like it's sheer downside. In some decks, that's going to be an upside. So if you can get the Surveil 2 to be an upside in your deck, and you can get losing 2 life to be an upside in your deck, this card's going to be actually really good in that deck. So in that deck, it's a little bit of a higher pick. Still not a really high pick, but definitely a little bit of a higher pick. Outside of that, it's your 22nd, 23rd card you're running as card advantage. Next up, we have Steampath Charger. This is 1 red and 1 for a 2/1 Lizard Warlock with Offspring 2, and when the creature dies, it deals 1 damage to target player. It's a common. It's not bad. You know, having your common be a 2-power 2-drop that can also be a 2-power and 1/1. A 2/1 and a 1/1 for 4 mana later in the game, and both of them ping for 1 when they die. It's one of the more meh commons we've seen today for sure, but it's still absolutely usable. This Offspring ability is making cards that would be super meh, only just barely meh, and I kind of like that. But next up, we have Season of the Burrow. We finally saw another season, the White Season. This is 2 white and 3 for a sorcery. Choose up to 5 paw prints. Choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw print, you create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. For 2 paw prints, you exile a non-land permanent. Its controller draws a card. For 3 paw prints, you return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. I think that last ability is a little better than it seems because we've seen a lot of 3-drops in this set already that are very powerful, relevant creatures. So being able to get a really important 3-drop back from the graveyard with an indestructible counter on it is insane. Something that's of the same power level as like a Rafine or something. Granted, Rafine itself is actually, rotating finally. Thank God. So not Rafine, but there are definitely going to be 3-mana cards that are of a, similar power level to Rafine in this new standard. So being able to return something like that and put an indestructible counter on it is insane. It's not a shield counter, remember. it's an indestructible counter, which means it just has indestructible forever, unless your opponent finds a way of getting rid of the counter, and that's just huge. That's just huge. Being able to do that as well as exile their best thing. Granted, they get to draw a card if you do that, but still, that seems nutty to me. That seems nutty to me. Or you just make 5/1/1s. If you're in the deck that cares about going wide or needs things to sacrifice or whatever, you could also just make 5/1/1s, and that's fine too. Or you could return your really good 3-drop with an indestructible counter and make 2/1/1s. Like, the versatility over here of getting to choose whatever you want to do. You could exile 2 non-land permanents and let them draw 2 card, like, who cares, right? Versatility is nuts. This card is fun. I like it. There's definitely going to be a deck that uses some kind of crazy broken 3-drop with this, right? That has to be a thing. That has to be a thing. If you have ideas about how you'd use this, let me know in the comments, because it seems really good. But next up we have Scales of Shale. 1 black and 2 for an instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each lizard you control. Target creature gets +2/+0 and lifelink and destructible until end of turn. Nice little bit of a combat trick here, right? +2/+0, lifelink, and indestructible are all super relevant. You can kill something you otherwise wouldn't have killed, gain a bunch of life to, you know, start to out-tempo your opponent and win the race, and save your thing that would have died. It's just like a ton of value, all in one instant speed tricky card, which I love. But obviously in Lizard decks, this is going to be way better. Being able to play this for just 1 mana could be nutty. So if you're in Lizards, you will pick this high, and it will 2.5 for 1 mana at instant speed and be bonkers. If you're not in Lizards, it's just kind of okay. You know, even if you have a few Lizards in your deck and you can, consistently get just 1 mana cost reduction but not the full 2, it's going to be okay. You might consider running it as a 22nd, 23rd card. But in Lizard Tribal, you're playing it. You are playing it. Next up we have Harnesser of Storms. 1 red and 2 for a 1/4 Otter Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature or otter spell, you may exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. This ability triggers only once each turn. But a nice way to get down some early, big butt blockers for, the aggro deck you're up against, while also getting you some late game card advantage after that. Just every non-creature or otter spell you play, if it's the first one each turn, is going to get you a free card to play. Unfortunately, it is until the end of turn and not until the end of next turn, but for a decently statted body that's going to help hold the fort and, at the uncommon rarity, you could do a lot worse, right? You want to play your cheap non-creature spell or otter spell first in your turn, see what you exile, and just get card advantage that if you manage to stay alive for enough turns and get the card advantage off this guy, eventually you just overwhelm the opponent with card advantage and win. So, pretty cool little uncommon. Next up we have Moonstone Harbinger. 1 black and 2 for a 1/3 bat warrior with flying and death touch. Whenever you gain or lose life during your turn, bats you control get +1/+0 and gain death touch until end of turn, but this ability triggers only once each turn. So another good example of a card that triggers off gaining life or losing life. So it's going to work really well with those other cards that we saw. And the fact that it buffs up all of your bats is really important. So if you're in deep into bat tribal, you definitely want to be slamming this guy. And you want to be trying to use as much gain life, lose life stuff as possible to get those triggers to be consistent. But if you can get 2 of these guys onto the battlefield, oh boy, your bat army is going to go to town, and it's going to be pretty gnarly. But even just the fact that it's a flyer with death touch is relevant too, because if they get a huge flying threat as a win con, like a big bomb down, you can always just block and trade with it. So, a lot of cool stuff that this enables. I think it's pretty cool. I'm liking the looks of Bat Tribal. Next up we have the last card of today. This is Starfall Invocation. And it is the white sweeper. It is the Wrath of God of the set. Is it as good as Sunfall? Not quite, but very close. Very, very close, which is scary to say. 2 white and 3 for a sorcery. As you play it, you may gift a card, which means you let your opponent draw a card before the rest of this resolves. And then you destroy all creatures. If the gift was promised, you return a creature card, put into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. So whereas with Sunfall, you get a creature token that's bigger based on the more things that you got rid of, this card gets you whatever creature you already had on the battlefield, whichever one's your best one, back from the graveyard. So Sunfall gets a little bit better, you know, if they're going wide. And also you don't have to gift a card to get the extra value with Sunfall. And also you get to exile with Sunfall. So because of those three things combined, I think Sunfall is better. That being said, there are definitely going to be ways to build around this card that will make it better. If you have a super relevant creature that's going to win you the game, being able to make sure that's still on the battlefield after the dust settles is huge. If you have ETB triggers, you'll get to re-trigger those. Imagine playing this. Oh god. I just realized this is going to be absolutely insane in Domain Ramp. Because if you've played your Atraxa and you still have to sweep, not only do you still keep your Atraxa, but you re-trigger its ETB ability, right? That seems bananas. Granted, you do have to let the opponent draw a card to do it. There are some downsides here, right? You're not exiling. If you want your thing back, you have to gift a card. You can't play it in a creatureless deck like you could Sunfall and still get value. There's definitely downsides, but it's really good. Like, Domain Ramp's gonna run this, right? And get back their Atraxa. Like, I have to assume that's the thing. That's the thing you're gonna do with this. But really, any deck that wants to wipe the board and has relevant creatures that they want to keep on the board is gonna be huge. I do like the fact that it comes back, though. It doesn't just stay. It doesn't get, like, indestructible or something and dodge the Starfall Invocation. Because you can't just sweep the board and then afterwards go to combat and swing in. Then again, if you have a big hasty guy, and that's the guy that comes back, you could do that. So, I don't know, a lot of really cool, interesting ways to use this, I think. If you have any ideas that I haven't touched on for this card, definitely let me know in the comments, because I think the card is really interesting. I'm worried that it's going to be just as broken as Sunfall, and Sunfall is obnoxious enough, and I can't stand that is still a thing in Standard and not rotating. But I digress. That's a discussion for another day, so let me know in the comments how you feel about this card, but that's going to do it for today. I've got another spoiler video primed and coming for the Day 4 cards, so definitely pay attention to that. That's going to be dropping soon. I've got a bunch of spoiler shorts on the way for stuff that we didn't cover in this video as well. A bunch of stuff I got to get to, so definitely look forward to that. If you haven't already liked the video, it helps this video get out to so many more people, and I really, really need the help, so thank you so much if you're one of those people that has liked the video. It means everything to me. I know I say it every time, but I'm being sincere. It honestly means everything to me. I would be nothing, and this channel would be nothing if it wasn't for you guys watching my videos. So thank you so much. We hit 10K subscribers. You should be proud of that because you helped do that. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Crazy stuff on the way. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there, and if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.